Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? This is Courtney Doggart, President of Network 2020, and I am very pleased today that we have Scott Smith, a senior expert on Afghanistan at the U.S. Institute for Peace, to talk to us about the state of play when it comes to the Afghanistan peace agreement. For those of you who were able to catch Scott live in October, he participated in a panel discussion just after the original talks fell through, and we're very pleased to have him back. He has over 25 years of experience working on Afghanistan-related issues, beginning with humanitarian in the mid-1990s. And between 2017 and 2019, he was based in Kabul as the Director of Political Affairs for the UN Assistance Mission in Afghanistan, and has held a variety of positions with the UN in Afghanistan, as well as the U.S. Institute for Peace. He is the author of Afghanistan's Troubled Transition, Peacekeeping Politics in the 2004 Presidential Election, and co-editor of Getting It Right in Afghanistan, as well as numerous articles. He has taught at Columbia and Boston University and is really an on-the-ground expert, and we're quite lucky to hear from him again today, especially on a day when there is a lot happening outside of the world of coronavirus. Afghanistan peace talks are ongoing. They've gone through several iterations, as he will explain, and we have our Secretary of State Pompeo just showed up just recently in Afghanistan to work on some of those talks. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Scott, who will give us the lay of the land. He'll speak for probably about 15 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. And just as a reminder, if you would like to ask a question, please email Brian at any time, and his email is B as in Brian, T as in Tom, H as in Harry, A as in Apple, N as in Nancy, G as in Goat at network2020.org, and I'll make sure that your question gets asked. So Scott, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Courtney. I'm speaking to you today with hopefully a sense of humility, because when I was with the UN towards the end of 2018 in Kabul, one of my consistent messages to Afghan politicians was, when you head into the presidential election next year, try not to have too much of a mess of it, because it's very unlikely that there will be, as there was in 2014 and 2009, a John Kerry coming to visit and to sort of help sort out the squabbles. I thought this administration didn't quite have the same level of interest. But then I woke up today to find that Secretary Pompeo was in Kabul trying to sort out what did become another electoral mess, and I'll get to some of the details of that in a little while. But I was ended up being wrong about that, and let's see what comes out of the visit. So we are asking ourselves the question of whether this Afghan peace process is dead already, and if it were dead, it wouldn't be the first time that it's died and then been resurrected. As Courtney mentioned, when I spoke to you in October of last year, it was right after President Trump had pulled the plug on the process, allegedly because of a Taliban attack in Kabul that had killed an American soldier. Then a few days later, he actually said the talks were dead. But then his envoy, Ambassador Zalmay Khalilzad, slowly got back to work, first negotiating the release of 2 Afghan university professors, and then gradually re-engaging with the Taliban in Doha on the substance of the agreement. And I'll come back to that. But the main point I wanted to make is that the reopening of the talks, and probably Pompeo's visit right now, continue to show how determined the Trump administration is to negotiate a deal that will allow the withdrawal of our troops from Afghanistan. So to understand sort of where we are right now, I think it's important to understand the structure of the negotiation, and to remember that in July of 2018, Trump upended a long-standing U.S. policy, which was to never have talks with the Taliban on the future of Afghanistan without including the Afghan government. At that time, our policy was to push for what we called an Afghan-led and Afghan-owned peace process. The problem was that the Taliban would not talk to the Kabul government, which it refused to recognize, and the Kabul government really had no interest in a genuine negotiation with the Taliban. For them, a political agreement would only lead to a loss of power and perhaps a loss of their own personal wealth as the international community withdrew. So I think the Trump administration came to the conclusion that to break out of this circularity, it would have direct talks with the Taliban, and they came up with an agenda of 4 specific issues. 1, which was the Taliban's main concern, a timetable for a U.S. troop withdrawal. 2, which was the U.S. main interest, Taliban guarantees that it would not harbor anti-American terrorists in the future. And then the 3rd and 4th issues were a commitment of the Taliban to negotiate a future political arrangement with the Kabul government, and to hopefully do that in the context of a ceasefire. So from July 2018 to the end of this past February, a few weeks ago, the main players were the U.S. and the Taliban. The Kabul government, President Ashraf Ghani in particular, complained bitterly about being excluded, but that exclusion, I think, was a price the U.S. was willing to pay to reach an outcome. And I keep coming back and trying to emphasize how radical this policy change was, both in terms of a change from our previous policy, but also I think it's really the first example I can think of the U.S. negotiating with a non-state actor, frankly, a terroristic group, if it's not formally identified as a terrorist group, on issues of key U.S. national interest. So after a lot of persistence, the deal was signed in February, and as far as I understand, that deal, the text of it, was basically the same as the deal that Trump had rejected in September. Now, my own view is that Trump's reaction in September was not really due to this Taliban attack. It was more because of the domestic criticism of the deal. His own political allies, like Senator Lindsey Graham, criticized it for, as he said, outsourcing our security to the Taliban. So I think there was a feeling that the political traffic would not bear this deal. So Khalilzad had to go back, and if he couldn't get something better in the text of the deal, he had to get something that made the deal look a bit different. And that was some sort of demonstration from the Taliban that they would be committed to a political process, and that they were capable of honoring the terms of the deal. So the first bit was the release of the Taliban, of the 2 hostages from the American University of Afghanistan, 1 American and 1 Australian. This wasn't, it was agreed with the Taliban. It wasn't done with no cost at all, because the Afghan government had to release 3 high-profile Taliban prisoners, including Anas Haqqani, the brother of the Taliban deputy. And here's where the problem that we face today was foreshadowed. The Taliban prisoners were officially in the custody of the Afghan government. Kabul was extremely reluctant to give them up, especially in the service of a negotiation that it didn't really see as benefiting them and from which they had been excluded. So there must have been a great deal of arm twisting behind the scenes to get President Ghani to agree to their release. And again, we come back to the problem of the structure of the deal, with the U.S. having committed to some degree the Afghan government to doing things without having included the Afghan government in the actual negotiation. The next concession, and this was even more significant, was, well, Khalilzad tried to get a ceasefire, or at least a reduction in violence from the Taliban. This was important to address critics of the process, who argued that the Taliban did not have full control over its own forces, and if you made an agreement with them, it would be meaningless for that reason. There had been quite a lot of back and forth of what the reduction of violence would look like, how would it be measurable. It had to be signed off by General Miller, the U.S. commander of Resolute Support Forces in Kabul. But it was rather extraordinary because for a week before the agreement was signed, there was a reduction of violence. Then the agreement was signed, and then it continued for another 7 days as per the agreement. And it was sort of extraordinary to see how the war could almost basically be turned off. On the 8th day of the reduction in violence, the Taliban resumed their attacks on Afghan positions, because another feature of this deal is that they've committed themselves not to attack U.S. and international positions. So now we're back at a sort of levels of violence comparable to what they were before, which is disappointing in terms of the spirit of the peace that we were hoping to have achieved, but in fact is not contrary to the letter of the agreement. So now the impasse that we're facing is mostly due again to the fact that the agreement implies certain actions that should be taken by Kabul without having involved them in the government in the negotiations. And there are 2 key things that we now want Kabul to do. One is the agreement calls for the release of up to 5,000 Taliban prisoners, and the Taliban would release up to 1,000 Afghan government prisoners. The Taliban are asking for 5,000 to be released. Quite understandably, Kabul is balking at this. It wants some guarantees that these prisoners will not become fighters again. And B, it doesn't want to cede so much leverage right at the beginning before talks have even started. So President Ghani has proposed a more limited release with future, I think around 1,500, with then future releases conditioned on progress in the inter-Afghan negotiations. Up until yesterday, the Taliban had not budged on this. They had not responded. But yesterday, it seems Vasser Hilzad reported that they had Taliban officials and Afghan government officials had a meeting by Skype, began discussing this. To my knowledge, this is the first direct contact of the Taliban and the government as negotiating entities. And now that we'll have to see whether or not they can come to an agreement on some version of a prisoner release. For me, the Taliban have been effective at maintaining maximalist positions. During the reduction in violence, they demonstrated that they had a capacity to control their movement, but they didn't really demonstrate, by going back to fighting, they didn't really demonstrate a real political will, I would say. With the prisoner release, I think it's important for them to show that they're able to compromise. Otherwise, the elections will, or the negotiations will not go very far. Now, according to this agreement, the negotiations, what we call inter-Afghan negotiations, were supposed to start on the 10th of March. They've been delayed by the prisoner release issue and by the fact also that President Ghani has yet to name a negotiating team. And this is whatever sort of 15-person team he intends to name, it will be controversial because a lot of people will feel that it's unbalanced, that they should have been included, and so forth. But so far, the names have not been announced formally, which means the team has not yet had a chance even to come together and begin preparing a strategy. The Taliban have had a year and a half negotiating experience with the U.S. They have cohesive positions, so this will place the Afghan government as something of a disadvantage. Now, then we come to the other major problem, which is the severe divisions within the Kabul political elite and what we're now calling the two-president problem. So throughout all of last year, while the negotiations were being held in Doha between the U.S. and the Taliban, Afghans were preparing for their third presidential election that was scheduled for September of last year. In Washington, frankly, there had been a bit of a debate as to whether both policies should be pursued simultaneously. And some of us feared that there could come a moment when the two processes would collide. We needed a certain amount of unity, or we thought we would need a certain amount of unity among Kabul politicians to engage with the Taliban on a common position. At the same time, nothing is more divisive than a presidential election. I think Khalilzad's preference was for the elections to be called off. Others felt they were important for the continuity of the state in case the peace process failed. And in any case, the decision was made to allow the elections to go ahead. And they were held, as I said, at the end of September. Turnout was extremely low. You had two figures who had been heading the government for the previous 5 years competing against each other. You had Taliban threats of violence and the loss of confidence in electoral institutions from some terribly run parliamentary elections in 2018. As always, the counting process was controversial and messy. It took about 5 months. In December, the Electoral Commission announced preliminary results saying Ghani had won 50% of the votes, slightly over 50% of the votes, and Abdullah had won 40%. Now, in the Afghan system, in order to avoid a second round, you need to get more than 50%. Ghani had about 10,000 votes above that 50% line, but there are a lot of complaints, as they always are, and I think many of us felt that that number could drop below 50% after the complaints were adjudicated. So after the IC gave its preliminary results, the action shifted to the Electoral Complaints Commission, which had to look at about 300,000 questionable votes. It then forwarded some instructions to the IEC to undertake certain audits and recheck certain things. We, who have been following these elections for some time, thought that would take several weeks. But within a week, the IEC simply declared that President Ghani had won. It only changed 453 votes. And this seemed, if not a little bit fishy, certainly a rushed and politically motivated decision. Ghani also announced that he would inaugurate himself within 1 week. He was persuaded to postpone it. The actual electoral law says it should be held within a month, not or a month after the election results are announced. In the end, he held his on the 9th of March. At the same time, Dr. Abdullah, his rival, held his own inauguration, saying that if the votes had been counted properly, he would have won the presidency. So now we had two people declaring themselves to be president. And Ambassador Khalilzad has been in Kabul trying to resolve this. I think basically trying to put together some sort of power sharing agreement, as there had been in 2014, between the same two who trust each other even less than they did 5 years ago. It's obviously greatly complicated the problem of forming a united Afghan negotiating team, and has delayed the start of what we hope to be inter-Afghan negotiations. Now we have the visit of Secretary of State Pompeo to Kabul, presumably with some firm messages and hopefully some sort of solution. Fundamentally, though, I think that President Ghani has been skeptical of, if not opposed to, this peace process, at least in the way it's been designed and implemented by Khalilzad. I also think that there was a compelling case that he was basically betting that Khalilzad would not reach an agreement with the Taliban, and was a bit thrown off when he had. He has a legitimate grievance. I think he feels that he was cheated out of his first term when the 2014 election dispute led us, again, Secretary of State John Kerry at the time, to pressure him into a power sharing agreement with Abdullah. He feels that he's a designer of reforms. I think he feels that he deserves another 5 years with continued international backing to implement his vision, rather than an agreement with the Taliban that will fundamentally transform what the Afghan state looks like right now, or they could fundamentally transform what the Afghan state looks like right now, and not certainly in the way that he, as a technocrat, would envisage. So there have been these delays. I think he's been trying to force a situation where we're put in a position where we have to sort of renew our support rather than risk greater instability. But I go back to the point I made at the beginning. There does seem to be, and again, the Pompeo visit yesterday demonstrates this, a strong determination of the Trump administration to bring home its troops, if possible, through a somewhat rational, if imperfect, negotiation process, and perhaps, if that is not possible, to bring them home anyway, with whatever consequences that would have for Afghanistan. So let me just make a few observations in conclusion. The first one is that, as I hope I've been able to convey, the process was complicated enough before the coronavirus crisis. I think this crisis will change attitudes in a major way. It's hard to see how people will continue to view Afghanistan as a top priority. The economic cost and the consequences of the virus crisis will, I think, make support to Afghanistan look even more costly. And as Barney Rubin at New York University has pointed out, this pandemic stresses the urgency of ending the war in Afghanistan, because it's transmitted much more quickly in conditions of war. But the measures that are being taken by everybody to address the pandemic, and particularly the travel restrictions, make it more difficult to have negotiations. That said, the Skype conversation that was held a few days ago is a small bright spot. Second, I would say that the Taliban have been obstinate negotiators. This is why it's taken so long. But when they've made commitments so far, they've kept them. And again, the Skype negotiation of the prisoner release is a positive sign. It's hard to figure out what exactly their political demands are, mostly because I'm not sure they've thought them through themselves in any great detail. The most optimistic take, and this comes from some people who are former Taliban and who are still in touch, is that they can accept substantively most of the current constitution. What they particularly object to is that, in their view, it was imposed on Afghanistan by foreigners. So a refounding, obviously there would likely be some amendments, and a constitution that looks like it's purely Afghan, as well as, of course, the end of the foreign military presence are their key demands. What about U.S. interests? I tend to think that we've led ourselves to believe for too long that Afghanistan is, absolutely essential to our national security. I think in the last 20 years, events around the world have changed. I'm not overly concerned about the national security implications of withdrawing from Afghanistan in the context of a deal with the Taliban. I also think while they've been stubborn and effective enough on the battlefield to fight themselves into a position where they can negotiate a share of power, they remain fundamentally very unpopular in Afghanistan. All the sort of annual surveys, particularly carried out by the Asia Foundation, bear this out. And I tend to think that their political influence will begin to wane as soon as a peace agreement is reached, if one is reached. My boss at USIP, Andrew Wilder, has always pointed out that religiously legitimized movements are always effective in opposition, but once they need to take some governing responsibility and are less able to do that, they become less popular. And then finally, there are, as has been pointed out, a number of ambiguities in the agreement. Some of these may or may not be in clearer terms in the so-called secret annexes. But one of the major ones is we've committed to a reduction of troops to around 8,600 in the first 130 days. The agreement then says it will withdraw our remaining troops in the following 9.5 months, but there's some sort of language that Taliban have to make certain commitments for us to do that. But these commitments are not really enumerated. My fear right now is, as the current impasse continues, we are already beginning or will begin the withdrawal of that first tranche of troops. The Taliban, seeing no progress or no on the political field, with the Afghan government still divided and unable to come up with a delegation, are probably likely to ramp up their spring offensive as they had planned. In which case, that will put the government in a weaker position and put us in front of a dilemma after the first 135 days of whether we keep our troops and end up fighting the war for another year, or whether we withdraw them and leave Afghanistan in a far weaker situation than we would like to. So let me conclude with that, and as Courtney said, I'm very happy to take any questions.
All right, thank you very much, Scott. Again, if you have any questions, please email them to Brian at bthang@network2020.org. And our first question is a technical one, is about whether or not Secretary Pompeo is accompanied by Ambassador Khalilzad, and it sounds like he may already be on the ground. And then just to expand on that too, it sounds like Ambassador Khalilzad and Ghani have maybe I'm speculating on this, but a bit of tension given the way that the power sharing agreement came about. And so, how effective do you think Khalilzad will be in this situation, and is that why we need Secretary Pompeo there as well?
Yeah. So he's I think he's already had his main meetings. There have been some pictures of him already on the media. What was interesting is that Ambassador Khalilzad was not in the meeting with President Ghani. He was represented by his deputy, Mali Fee. But as far as everybody understands, Khalilzad is in Kabul. And it might have been, for whatever reason, and people have noted this, and perhaps for the reasons that you're suggesting, the secretary decided to meet Ghani without Khalilzad. There's a kind of what I call a psychodrama level to this, because obviously Ambassador Khalilzad and President Ghani know each other very, very well. I think it goes back to middle school, if not earlier. They've both been very prominent Afghans in the sort of international community, and through this traumatic period of Afghan history, and now they're butting heads in a way that really only one of them can win. If I'm correct when I say that Ghani fundamentally doesn't want this process, Khalilzad is, under instructions to deliver it, and that has created a huge amount of tension. You may recall that in March, so about a year ago, President Ghani's national security advisor was in Washington, and he made some stunning statements, not just criticizing but really insulting Ambassador Khalilzad, saying that he was doing this to become viceroy of Afghanistan, and he had his own agenda, and for which he was, the national security advisor was harshly rebuked, and in fact, the U.S. refused to deal with him for quite a long time. But that's sort of at the personal level, the kind of tension that has always been behind this process.
All right, thank you, Scott. Our next question is along those lines, but could you talk a little bit about some of the differences between Ghani and Abdullah, and depending on who prevails in this election, how do you think that might change the outcome of the negotiations with the Taliban?
So, the differences are, I think they have sort of very different, well, they're not hugely different ideas about reform. I think Ghani's are more developed. He's obviously thought very deeply about, what institutions are required for a state to function. He wrote his Fixing Failed States book about this. Abdullah is, I think, much more of a sort of a consensus builder. I don't think he has very detailed ideas. In some sense, he's easier to work with. What happened in 2014, of course, as I mentioned, was that these two were put together in a power sharing agreement that was not very clearly articulated about who had what powers. And over time, in some very artful ways, I would say, President Ghani was able to get the upper hand and minimize the influence of Abdullah. And you could see this in the number of cabinet appointments of people who were loyal to Abdullah, the governors, and that sort of thing, which is one of the metrics for measuring this power sharing. And what happened, though, is that there's been a huge loss of trust between Abdullah and his camp, which we can generally call an opposition, and President Ghani, which means, and even if this is the challenge of Pompeo right now, is even if you agree to something, nobody trusts Ghani to honor it in the way that it was intended. So it was difficult enough in 2014, but because of that loss of trust, and frankly because of President Ghani does have a very solitary way of exercising leadership. He's surrounded by very few people. He trusts hardly anybody, and that will make some sort of power sharing combination much harder to bring about. Now, I don't think that Abdullah has a clear claim to. However he did his arithmetic on his votes, I don't think it's a very compelling or convincing claim. On the other hand, I think it's clear that Ghani used the resources of the state and even other sorts of more direct intimidation, possibly, to get certain decisions going his way. So it's not exactly as if his election is the cleanest. All the international statements after the IEC announced their results were sort of took note of the announcement. They didn't really congratulate anybody. But President Ghani obviously in this has the upper hand. He's the one sitting in the presidential palace. In the end, Ambassador Khalilzad went to, as I said, they had competing simultaneous inaugurations. Ambassador Khalilzad went to President Ghani's, I think, with the proviso that Ghani would agree to something on the prisoner release and would nominate a team. And in exchange for that, we gave him whatever level of legitimacy Khalilzad's presence would have signified. In the end, Khalilzad hasn't really got either of those things very, very, very fully. But I think the distrust will mean that whoever Ghani nominates on this team is likely to also be distrusted by what I'm calling the opposition, and there will be a period of crisis probably that emerges from whatever announcement he makes regarding a negotiating team.
Okay, thank you. And again, just a reminder to everybody, if you would like to ask a question, please email Brian at bthang@network2020.org. The next question touches a little bit on, I think, what you just finished up, and you had mentioned this a bit earlier as well, but it's the question of legitimacy. So, how, assuming that these Skype talks do go somewhere, how effective do you think that they can be, and what will it take to have this agreement really be legitimate in the eyes of all stakeholders?
Yeah, very good question. And one that I don't think there's been so much thinking about right now, because we're just trying to get the process going. I think it will require a few different things. And there has been a little bit of thought on the architecture of the discussion on the Afghan side. So the first thing it requires is a negotiating team that looks balanced in terms of representing generations, in terms of representing movements, the various Afghan political communities, and so forth. And again, that won't be easy. The second thing, though, is that legitimacy in the end will be enhanced if this team is seen as negotiating on behalf of that political community which has accepted the constitution that we're currently under, not on behalf of the government of President Ghani. And that means there probably needs to be behind the negotiating team some kind of commission of notable politicians. My preference would be to have the negotiating team itself be younger and more sort of, in many cases, more able figures, and then you have the traditional leaders behind that can then issue instructions to the negotiating team, as well as and when the team runs up against those instructions, can refer back and say, well, here's where we are on this issue. How do we move next? What possible compromises are available? So in the same way, by the way, the Taliban negotiating team always reports back to the leadership of the Taliban in Quetta. If we can get to actually having an agreement, then I think there will be the discussion of how is this legitimized in terms of the popular will. And I would not be surprised if we went back, if not an election or a referendum, which is often dangerous, at least some kind of loya jirga, in the way that was done in 2004 to ratify the agreement, which may be in the form of almost a new sort of constitution. So again, I mean, we have a long way to go before we get there, but I think those are the main things for legitimacy. Obviously, if this is all done, even if it takes a long time, in an atmosphere of a ceasefire, I think it will be appreciated by people, whatever the defects the ultimate agreement may end up or inevitably having.
All right, thank you. We have a couple more questions coming in. So one is, in your opinion, what steps need to be taken to create stronger institutional capacity for the development of greater trust in the voting system? And how realistic are reaching those milestones?
Well, okay. So, my line on this is, the 2019 election was unique in the sense that it was done based on biometric voter verification. All right, that means the government sort of purchased these biometric verification machines. You had to go and be identified with a fingerprint, with a photo of your election ID card, and I think a photo of yourself. The IEC took the decision that only votes that could be corroborated by this technique would be counted. That's probably why we had so few votes. There are about 2 million out of 10 million registered voters, and it was a courageous decision. And you would think it's sort of somehow unimpeachable, but it was very interesting to see the way in which the Afghan electoral institutions managed to inject enough ambiguity, even in this sort of straightforward method of corroboration, so that we're still not really sure what the real result is. And I think this is where we have a flaw whose solution we have not yet been able to find in terms of the electoral institutions, I think, not really being responsible for giving bad news, perhaps, to the incumbent, and we've seen in every election how we face these kinds of controversies and extreme ambiguity about what is normally counting up a number of votes for different candidates and then deciding who the winner is. I don't know how. I mean, we've tried many different things after the 2014 election, then this biometric voter verification for the 2018-2019 election. It's I think somehow a question of attitudes more than anything else, and perhaps the real flaw may not be in the electoral institutions, which worked up to a point in this election. It's more in the highly centralized power dynamic represented in this current structure, where is very much a winner takes all system, and that creates huge incentives to make sure that if you're in power, you stay in power.
All right. Okay. Thank you. Looks like we have time for one last question. Hopefully, actually, I see a couple coming in, but let's see. I'll ask this one, and then we'll see if we can maybe group the last couple that are coming in. But it seems that for some time, Trump has been firmly committed to achieving a withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan, in part at least to present this result as a major achievement in his re-election campaign. And now that the coronavirus crisis and Trump's handling or mishandling of it may have weakened his political support in the U.S., and given, as you mentioned, that Afghanistan and other foreign policy issues are getting less attention as the U.S. and world focuses on the pandemic, do you believe that Trump will be even more inclined to go ahead with troop withdrawal, regardless of whether the Taliban live up to their part of the agreement or not?
I think there will be that temptation. I mean, the dynamic of this, the debate so far has been no side is going to win this war, so there has to be a political solution. As I said, once we decided to break out of the Afghan-owned, Afghan-led paradigm, we ended up with the Khalilzad process, and there's been, even since September and now, as I mentioned, there's been a kind of gradual acceptance that we can live with the deal with the Taliban, which is astounding in some ways, and whenever somebody writes a history of this, I think we'll need to go back and look at why the deal that was not acceptable in September was acceptable in February. But against this position has always been the ongoing national security position, which is, well, we do need to stay in Afghanistan because it's vital for our national security. We have gains that we want to protect, and it's better. And the cost has become now acceptable to us. We're spending less than we were before. Our troops are not on the front line and they're not dying. So why not just continue this level of commitment? I think that's the position that Ghani has been holding on to. But I do think that while these debates are still alive, I think the coronavirus, all the issues that were mentioned, the factors mentioned in the question, will affect the relative attractiveness of that. And I think it makes it more likely to either insist on the negotiation, or, as I said, when we come to that moment after 135 days and decide whether we're withdrawing further, continue a troop withdrawal on our own terms, and more or less sort of relying on the Afghans to try to sort themselves out, and either defend themselves or come to an agreement with the Taliban. One other thing to add is, every 4 years there's been donor conferences committing funding to the Afghan government, which depends entirely both for its civilian and security sides on international funding. The next of those conferences is in I think it's either November or December of this year. So all the countries that have been backing the Afghan government, that have been giving money to its Ministry of Finance, will now be making calculations about how much they're going to support for the next 4 years. It is hard to think, even before coronavirus, that number was going to go up.
That's a really interesting point. Thanks for bringing that up. One final question, but before we let you go, and that's of the U.S. role going forward. I mean, even if we do see that the troop drawdown, over however many months and days, what role do you see the U.S. needing to play going forward? I mean, clearly there are other forms of support other than military, and what do you think is needed in order to retain some sort of peace in the country?
Yeah, I mean, again, so the decision needs to be made on to what degree do we continue to fund the Afghan government, especially if the peace process moves slower than we expect. I think the point that you made in the previous question about our own election calendar will mean that there will be more and more pressure on the Afghan government, to the extent that we're able to provide pressure, but it could include threats of withdrawing funds to get them to make the compromises necessary for a peace process. I don't think anybody, I mean, what would need to be mapped out is, what does minimal support that prevents collapse look like? And I think I imagine that's probably a calculation that some people are beginning to make, both on the military side and on the civilian side. One of the problems is that in our long support, from the very beginning of the Afghan National Army in particular, and our role in building up the security forces, I think we've created complex systems that rely on a certain amount of presence. We're giving a lot of money that requires us to be there to make sure it's used accountably. I don't think that we're at a point where we can trust the Afghans in charge to sort of account for that money without us being present. In fact, corruption inside the Afghan security forces is a major reason why the Taliban have been able to achieve on the battlefield the position that they have. So I think that there has to be that kind of calculation of, what is the minimum that we want to see in terms of the survivability of this government, and what is that going to cost? And as I say, I imagine that will be less than what we're providing right now. But I think for now, there's probably still be enough policy consensus to avoid a complete collapse, which could happen if we withdrew certainly all our troops and all of our money.
All right, Scott, thank you very much for participating. And I have to admit, it was actually, even though this is still a rather somber topic, it was nice to take our minds off of the coronavirus. And I also want to say thank you just for your sustained commitment to Afghanistan over several decades. So we really appreciate it.
Yes, just sustained commitment or a trap, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But thanks for hosting this. I think it's great that we're able to do this even under these circumstances.
Yes, absolutely. I really appreciate it. And just a quick note to those who are listening, we have our next call coming up on Thursday, and this will be with Dr. Gigi Quick-Gronval. She is a senior scholar and associate professor at Johns Hopkins at the Center for Health Security, and she will be talking about biosecurity and bioterrorism. So it should be another interesting call. Please RSVP to Brian, and we're adding more calls as we speak, so please check our website and do let others know about this as well. So thank you, Scott. Thank you all for listening. Stay safe out there, and we look forward to hopefully reconnecting with all of you on Thursday. Bye-bye.